Now, one thing I want to cover as well that's not necessarily directly related to how a Maya scene works, but it's directly related to how a Maya scene is built. And that's basically the difference between saving out a scene as Maya Ascii or Maya binary. Now, some of you might already be familiar with these different terms, but the very simple definition between them is that Maya Ascii will be saving it out as a text file. So it's human readable. You can open up this and read what's happening, while a Maya binary file will be stored as a binary format, which is a lot closer to machine code, so that it's not really human readable, and it's something that the computer can read a lot faster and just execute and save out a lot faster. It will also mean that your file sizes are smaller. So let's just do a quick little demo of that before we go into a bit more detail on that. So let's just take T-Rex and get that into the scene. And you know what? Let's just subdivide it a couple of times. Smooth. I want to smooth it. Cool. So now I'm not going to do anything here. Like, this is the only thing that I really have in the scene. There's no history on it, nothing fancy. I've just subdivided it a couple of times so that we have a bit of poly history to it. So I'm just going to save this now, and I'm just going to call this T-Rex. So I'll save that as an ASCII file, and then I'll go and I'll save the same exact scene. I haven't done anything to it as a binary file. Cool. So let's just open up. So you can see now we've got it even shows up in Maya, which is quite handy. You've got MA and MB. So if I select this, you can see that this is 4 megabytes, while this is actually 2 megabytes. So 2.17 and 4.30. So you can see already here, just with this little example, there's quite a bigger difference in file size. So if this is smaller, then why would you want to do it? Like, if it's smaller, it loads faster. Why would you ever want to save out something in human readable form? Well, it's because it can really help you a lot of times. It can help you recover files or part of files that would normally be corrupted. For instance, if you're saving out the file and Maya crashes, or there's just something weird that happens with Maya, or could even be on your file system as you're saving out the file. If anything of that kind of corruption happens as you're saving out a binary file, that data is pretty much gone. But if you're saving it out as an ASCII file, it will still have all the data saved there, just as in plain text, so you might be able to recover things. Now, another thing that you can do as well is it can actually help you diagnose why your file sizes are quite large. And that's because you have access to the human readable version of each file and, of each node that's in the scene. Let's just open up and see what I'm talking about here. So I'm just going to take my MA file here. I'm just going to pull it into PyCharm. So you can see actually what we have here is an MA file is basically just a bunch of mel. It's a bit different. You can't exactly copy and paste everything here because it's a bit more different. But if you go through here, and if you're familiar with mel or just Python commands, you should be able to read what's going on here. You can even see here that in the very beginning of the file, you can see that it says create node, and it will create a transform node, and it will give it the name persp. And that's actually our perspective camera. So you can see now on the next line, it does a new create node, and it creates a node of type camera, and it gives it the perspective shape name, and the parent will be perspective. So this is actually where it creates so for this, that's the code that defines and creates your perspective camera. And if we scroll down, we can see here, all of this defines our top camera. And here we have the front camera, and so on and so on. So you can see now that we come down here, we actually get to our T-Rex, where again, it will first create our node, our transform node of T-Rex, and then it will create a mesh with T-Rex shape. So what you can actually see here now is the actual mesh data. So everything that's really represented for a shape, as we talked about previously, where it comes to UVs, vertex positions, all of these things are actually set here. So you can actually read through here and you can see it basically sets the, I believe this is the UV, so I'm not 100% sure on that, but it basically sets all of these attributes here. So you could even go in here and start modifying these. So again, you can see here, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to look through all the time, but you can see it goes on for quite some time. And this is sort of why when it starts to come into the ASCII versus binary, saving all of this information here as binary is just a lot easier, instead of making it into a more human readable form. Not that I'm going to say that this is super readable all the time, but I believe here we're now starting to come down to like the edges and how that's being created. So there's a lot of things that's going on here. Now, this is where you can then start to see a bit. You could, I've had colleagues where in the past they've actually written code to go from each create node. So from each create node to the next one, just see how many lines are between them to try and figure out like how much space or like how many lines does this this individual kind of node take up. And that was actually quite helpful for us to really figure out where we were seeing the file sizes and like really inflate on some characters. Another thing is that it can really help you if you have issues with plugins, for instance, that is a constant issue. For instance, where if you remove the plugin, but it keeps popping back up. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Turtle plugin, and that's been a bane for many productions. And I know there's people who've made almost antivirus code where it's, I believe it's just a Python script that will go through for each of the files. And if we go up, let me just scroll up here a bit. So yeah, you can see here in the beginning, it says requires Maya 2020. So that just defines the version of Maya that this file was saved out with. So normally if you try to open this in another Maya, unless you have the, where is it? I can't remember where it is right now, but there is an ignore file version option. So unless you have that ignore, it will say, it will warn you. So you could even go in and do that. But any requires here that says with one of these names is basically a plugin. So you can see here it requires the stereo camera because that was just on by default as it is in Maya. MTOA, which is the Arnold plugin. Again, the stereo camera twice for some reason. And so if you had another plugin here, you could see something like requires, let me just say, hello everyone. For instance, so now PyCharm autosave, so I've just saved this now. So if I try to open up this file again, the MA file, we should now see in the script editor that we get a runtime error. Now, we get, of course, all the warnings, but you can actually see that we get an error. Let me just clean out this and open it again, just so that it's very clear. Don't save. Cool. So you can see first line, of course, is which one do we want to open? And then we get the error, right? We should never really have errors when we open up files. Warnings, fair enough, but errors we should not have. So you can see what it actually says there is that there's a runtime error. Let me just make this a bit bigger. And it says plugin hello everyone was not found on Maya plugin path. So that's sort of something that, you know, we can go in here and we can just get rid of that and make sure that that's saved again. And I'll just clear this. And we can open, you can now see that that error that we had is gone. But we still have these warnings because there's a bunch of like textures that I'm assuming is going into this thing here. So, you know, we could even go in and clean that up, but fair enough, these aren't disallowing us from opening the scene. But actually having errors might be an issue in your pipeline. For instance, if you're rendering on a farm, any errors might cause you to not be able to continue on with your process that you need to do on the farm. So being able to get rid of these outside of Maya can be very, very useful, because actually getting rid of it in Maya can be very, very tricky sometimes. It's just one of these things that like easily pops up very quickly. Now, another thing that's good to know about these things is that if you need to do changes on many objects, sometimes it can actually be too slow to do this in Maya, and it can actually be a lot faster or easier to do this either via Python or just a normal text editor. So I've actually had this on production before where I needed to change I believe all of the shape names for a bunch of curves were exactly the same. The transforms had different names, but the shapes were different. Sorry, the shapes were exactly the same. Now, actually doing this in Maya, there was so many, and the scene was so heavy that it actually it took up all the RAM that I had on the machine at that point, which I believe was 64 gigs. So it just became impossible to work with it in Maya. And the solution was actually opening it up in, I think I used Sublime at that point. And I just did a mass selection, find every single one, and then I found a rename function in Sublime that just let me rename each line with just a counting integer at the end. And that really saved me. So that was super useful to have. Another thing where I've used it in production where it can be really useful is that the fact that when you, let's say that we've now saved out our T-Rex, but we reference it in to a file. So let's just save this and say this is our ref, and let's just call it the anim file, because this is where I want to animate it. So if we just open up here again now, if we look at the anim file, we can see that at the top here, it actually specifies the path to this file. Now that means that we can go in here and actually just change the path to the reference without having to open Maya. And it might sound very trivial, but it's actually extremely useful, because it actually allows you to switch out references that might be very heavy to load. I've had this where it's where I've had, I believe it was a facial rig that was connected into an animation scene, and it was taking a good half hour to open because it was just so slow. There was so much going on. There was a bunch of different things happening, and I just need to open up that file and export out something. So just being able to open it up, and I literally just changed the end of the line to be to the new file that I wanted, and it took me a good 10-15 seconds instead of having to wait for hours almost, because I need to do this on many files. So for me, it was really useful. Cool. So we've gone through now a couple of these things here. So I hope this is showing some potential, but I'll go over a bit more in how you can actually modify the MA files in the next video as well.